Hey there, I am back for a second day. Basically, what I'm doing is in the run up to Atheism for Lent, which starts on the 14th of February, I'm going to give different kind of reflections on the material that we'll be looking at. So, yesterday I looked at the first week. And we looked at Knight and Squire, and it's kind of setting the scene for this journey that many of you will be taking with me. I think we've got three or 400 people so far. Um, so today I want to look a little bit at the second week, which is really the first week in a sense, because the first few days are kind of setting the scene, reflections that kind of hopefully just help us get in the right frame of mind. Whereas the next week is where we get into some of the meat of the subject. And one of the things that I want people to get out of Atheism for Lent, and I've seen this happen, is in a sense to enrich and deepen our understanding of this tiny word God, um, to explore what is going on in the name God, which is something that John Caputo talks about. He doesn't talk so much about God, but he talks about the event that is taking place in the name God, the conversations that are taking place in that name. It's almost like the word God is like the TARDIS in Doctor Who. It's this tiny thing that opens up to this vast and infinite universe. And, if you have a cursory glance at philosophy and theology, you see that this tiny word has evoked some of the most beautiful poetry and prose and some of the most sophisticated thinking and critiques. And I want to kind of like explore that a little so that if nothing else, by the time people finish Atheism for Lent, there will be a deeper appreciation of this word. And actually, we'll start to see how this word transcends theism and atheism. That actually this word has an interesting interplay between theism and atheism within it. Now, at the very beginning of the journey, that will sound strange because, in a sense, atheism is the opposite of God. God is a word for the theists. And only the theists want it, the atheists don't want it, But what we'll discover actually is that there's a much more interesting thing going on, and that the word God has a much more complicated relationship with theism and atheism, agnosticism. But we have to start somewhere, and so where we're going to really start in the second week is with the popular notion of the word God. Right, the simple notion of the word God that we see in daily life, that we, the kind of God that people are arguing about in high school and on YouTube videos and whatever. And we start there simply because it's a good place to start. And in fact, by the second to last week, I want to show how even the simple understanding of God might have something insightful to give us, and doesn't necessarily have to be thrown out entirely. But we're going to start with the critiques of this simple notion of God as a being that is kind of like us. And I've chosen a number of thinkers from various times who I think really explore and critique this notion of God in an interesting way. Philosophy itself begins with the critique of the gods and with the authorities. I mean, philosophy in some ways can be seen as it begins when you start to ask questions of what you have previously assumed. When you start to become aware of your awareness, that you start to see that, as Anais Nin says, you see the world not as it is, but as you are. That, in a sense, how you've been given the world tells you a lot about yourself, but also that we often just take our view of the world as correct and as right. And philosophy begins really when you start to bracket that out, you start to question. So we're starting with Epicurus, who has this very simple critique of the notion of God as omnipotent and as benevolent. But we're also going to listen to a little bit of Darwin's autobiography, where he talks about his own struggle with the erosion of his confessional religiosity in relation to his work. I've got a little, I recorded myself doing an excerpt from a famous speech by Robert Ingersoll, who was a great 20th century kind of agnostic atheist figure, who could pack massive stadiums or halls anyway, because he was such a brilliant communicator, and he would critique religion. And he's a very moral, interesting character. So we've got a variety of different things going on in that week. But the one that I'll mention here in this kind of short introduction is actually a guy from the 1600s and early 1700s who wrote the first systematic text on atheism. So this is the first book that systematically puts forward the atheist position. And he's not very well known, and there's probably a reason for that, but he's really interesting because his name is Jean Millier, and he was a Catholic priest. And he was a Catholic priest all his life until he died. And after he died, it was discovered that he'd written this vast book, which is very meandering and repetitive at times, but also at times beautifully written. This polemic against theism and also against authorities. He was very, very much against monarchy, aristocracy, hierarchy. He was a priest who was well known to defend his parishioners, to stand up for the lowly and the poor, to really care for his community. And it is just interesting that, you know, he is the one who wrote the first systematic critique. Now, of course, the simple explanation for that, the one kind of you'll find some atheists saying, is that, well, of course, you know, he was on the inside. He saw the hypocrisy of the church. He saw, you know, he read the scriptures and saw the contradictions for himself. So, you know, of course, he was in it so much that he kind of was confronted by all of the problems. But compelling as that might be in some ways, the truth might be actually more interesting and complicated. And as you read Testament, you begin to see this, because although he influenced Voltaire and the French Revolution, all of this kind of, like, he was an influential figure in France. But you can see that a lot of his polemic kind of actually comes from his training as a theologian and as a religious figure. That although he has this great critique, it's a critique of God, but also primarily it's a critique of abuse of power, authority figures who speak in the name of God, powerful figures who care nothing for kind of the peasants of the day, right? So it's a very moral critique. And you start to get the impression that actually this atheism, even within Jean Millier's work, is influenced by his theology and comes from it, and is not so much a betrayal of it, but at times a reflection of that theology taken incredibly seriously, taken seriously than most other people. Now, he doesn't develop it in that way. He's not the greatest thinker in the world or anything like that. But you can see in this, 15th century or 17th century, critique, you can see the idea that maybe the atheism is not some enemy of theology, but is intertwined in a more interesting way. So, of course, like after that, you have Feuerbach, who's a philosopher that I've always enjoyed reading, who says that anthropology is the secret of theology. And Feuerbach comes in as a materialist who says, I am a friend of the theologians. And he read theology deeply and seriously. He wrote a book on Luther. He understood theology better than most theologians of his day. And he said, the secret of theology is atheism. is an embrace of the material world, of the rejection of authority that we have to bow our knee to. It is about autonomy and about enriching humanity, caring for one another, and that actually, when theology is taken seriously, you come to this materialist position. Lacan once famously said something to the effect that only priests can really be good atheists. And I kind of think that maybe he had Jean Millier in mind when he said this. Now, part of what you can understand from this saying, part of what Lacan is talking about, is that in a sense, we are very superstitious creatures. Human beings, we may think we're not superstitious, but we have to touch taps an equal number of times, or we don't believe in anything, but we go to a fortune teller, or we believe in the invisible hand of the market, or we believe that money will make us whole, right? All of these very superstitious kind of notions. And so for Lacan, we all tend towards a very religious, superstitious notion of God. Even if we intellectually don't believe in it, we tend to believe in it in our being. There's actually really interesting empirical data that supports this. They find that it doesn't matter whether you call yourself a theist or an atheist, people find it equally difficult to pray to God to kill their family, or to make something terrible happen to a friend. And what's interesting about the experiments they've done, I might reference this actually in Atheism for Lent, but there's no discernible difference between belief systems. That strangely we have this very superstitious aspect to ourselves that we're often not conscious of. And so Lacan is saying it's actually those people who give themselves over to the study of theology and who really explore those notions who can become freed from them, who find rituals of life that can help free them from them as well. So what's interesting is, in contrast to kind of New Atheism, which kind of sees atheism as an enemy of theology, and vice versa, what people like Lacan and Ernst Bloch and others are saying is that actually there is, and you see it in the prophets, you see it in the Hebrew scriptures, there is a very gritty, earthy message in the text about justice, about righteousness, about real freedom and liberation for people, for real flesh and blood people. And that also for someone like Lacan, a notion that in order to free yourself from this superstitious notion of God, you kind of, in a sense, need to throw yourself into a kind of a theological world. And it's through that you can find freedom from it. Now, that won't make much sense at this point, but that's part of what we'll discover as Atheism for Lent goes on. I'm going to start putting meat on the bones of this and start to try to show why this kind of weird, surreal world that I'm describing might actually make a lot of sense. And we'll move into the existential theologians, etc. But I just wanted today to mention Jean Millier, because I think it's important to bear in mind that this first great critique came from a lifelong Catholic priest who stayed a Catholic priest till the day he died, and who, in a strange way, his theology led him to this polemic and to this kind of this attack against the evil of hierarchy and how God plays into that type of hierarchy. All right, I'm going to see if you've got any questions or thoughts or comments, and then I will let you go. Let's see, let's hit refresh. I'm seeing your comments. A lot of people saying hi. Some people saying about the tour. Yeah, I don't see any questions. I mean, there probably isn't very many questions because I'm just kind of given a very basic outline of something. But yeah, if you want to take away anything from this little reflection, it's that even at the very beginning of this systematic development of atheism, which we, in some respects, we can see in David Hume, who will be another figure we look at. He wrote this Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, where three figures are discussing the existence of God. And, so with Hume and with Millier and others, we see that already the critique is enmeshed within theology. And actually, we may discover that some theological figures have a more robust and stronger critique of God, of this idea of God as a being, than we find in people like Harris or Lawrence Krauss or Dawkins. That these critiques are actually said better and more harshly and with more rigor within the theological tradition, which is sometimes a surprise for people the first time they discover it. Okay, so that's me. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about week 3. And in week 3, we're going to then look at the mystics and how the mystics explored the kind of the dance between theism and atheism, and how people like Anselm and Eckhart developed a very sophisticated understanding of atheism that still has like importance and resonance today. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow. Take care.